من پرسیس کریم هستم، نویسنده و استاد ادبیات هستم. تو شهر برکلی زندگی میکنم. I'm a seeker of culture, I'm a seeker of connection. That I always feel that when I can connect with other human beings or when I can connect with nature, I have something to restore me and to bring back to my life. And that my life is part of that river that I talked about. That, you know, I'm not just somebody's mother, I'm somebody's teacher, I'm somebody's neighbor, I'm somebody's friend. And my responsibility is to them. And so I have to care for the home I live in, you know, my literal, this place where we're sitting, but also the home of my planet and my people, you know. And my people means, you know, I feel a connection to strangers in Gaza as much as I feel a connection to people in my neighborhood. So when I see what's happening to Palestinians, and when I see what's happening to Iranian people, I'm affected by it. I'm the last of 8 children from my father, 6 from my mother. My father was an immigrant from Iran who came in 1947 after the war. And my mother also came in 1948 from France after the war. My parents met in Chicago, and my mother got pregnant with my oldest brother. Meanwhile, my father had been married in Iran, had 2 children, but was separated from his wife. And he had been sent by the Iranian government after the war because during the war he worked on the railroads when they were transporting munitions to the Soviet Union for the war effort. He was promoted to superintendent of the Iranian National Railroads just before the war, and he worked to expand the railroads to bring munitions to the Soviet Union. So after the war, he was basically commissioned to come to the United States and do some research on the American railroad system to transform the Iranian railroad system from a wartime use to civilian use. So he came and he rode the railroads in the United States for a year and basically wrote a report all over he rode the railroads all over the country, wrote a report, sent it back to Iran, and never heard from the Shah. And meanwhile, my father had this fascination with the United States as a boy. My father said Iran will never be able to get out from under the thumb of Britain and Russia, Soviet Union. So for him, the idea of coming to the US was this possibility that opened in his life. He met my mother, and then he started a whole new life in the United States. And I'm the product of that union between a French immigrant woman and my father. When I was in 7th grade, my father went back to Iran for the first time in a very long time. He'd been in the 60s, but he was doing some work. He was a mining engineer, and he went back to Iran in 1973. And when he came back, he brought me some turquoise jewelry, some handicrafts, and he brought me 3 45 records of Gugush. And Gugush was huge in Iran at this time. And I remember standing in our living room listening to these records, and I was so stirred by the sound of her voice and what she was saying without any consciousness of really, like I knew maybe 4 or 5 words. And I was like, this place is so beautiful if it can produce this kind of music and this kind of stirring passion. So in a way, that sparked my initial interest in wanting to connect to my Iranian heritage. In 1979, when the revolution happened and the hostage crisis happened, I was just finished with high school, and I went to Norway for a year. I was in an exchange program. So I lived in Norway for a year, and I was watching what was happening in Iran, and I was watching what was happening in the US, as if both places were my cousins feuding with each other. And I decided there's a lot of this story that's not being told in the media. So when I came back to the United States after that year abroad, I started university, and I lived in a house, and one of my roommates was Iranian. We cooked Persian food, and he taught me some Persian, and I just knew that, like, I'm still interested in this, and I have to figure out what my association is with Iranian culture. So I graduated from college, and then I worked here in Berkeley at a newspaper, and then I got a job as an editor at UC Berkeley. And while I was there, I thought, you know, I need to like go to school and learn more about Iran and my heritage. So then I went to University of Texas at Austin at the start of the first Gulf War. In 1990, I went to UT Austin, and I did a master's in Middle East study, and I started taking Persian formally. And then I got a PhD in comparative literature. And one of the topics I was really fascinated by was reading the literature of Iranians who had left Iran immediately after the revolution. While I was working on my PhD, I ended up meeting a lot of people who were like me, either half Iranian, born in the US of one Iranian parent, or people who came immediately after the revolution and struggling to sort of find their way in US society. And that's when I decided to start working on Iranian American literature. So I had been reading my whole life immigrant literature by Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans. I was really fascinated with the human story and the ways that people make their lives anew in new places. And in some ways, I was really paying my respects to my own parents. So in 1998, I co-edited an anthology of Iranian American writing called A World Between with a classmate of mine who was also working on his PhD. He was Iranian. And it was the first ever anthology of Iranian writing in English. And it was such a big deal because there was nothing that existed. So that anthology came out in 1999. My father lived through World War I and through World War II, and both my parents lived through military occupation in France and in Iran. And then when they came to the US, in some senses they had to recreate their lives completely new, and they were from two different cultures navigating a third culture. So all that lives inside of me and is part of my horizon of understanding that I'm always looking to draw on. And I do that also as a teacher. I teach at San Jose State. I'm a professor of literature and creative writing there. And my passion is to introduce my students to the world through literature. So whenever possible, I have them read Iranian writers or Middle East writers or writers of immigrant backgrounds, partly to arrest their assumptions about what it is to be American, but also to arrest their assumptions about the world, because many times they think they know what the world is and they've never really either traveled or they themselves have not really had questions about what's going on in the world. Why are all these people migrating from a place like Syria in huge numbers, braving terrible conditions to come to the West? Often they don't have enough of an introduction to the beginning of the story to understand the ending of the story. So my fascination as a teacher is the same fascination I have as a writer, to always be drawing out the human story and the stories of marginalized people who sometimes don't have a voice. I'm the youngest child, and I'm the youngest girl. So my experience was my brothers often assumed I couldn't do things that they could do. And also my father, who was raised in a very patriarchal society and a very patriarchal time, made some of the same assumptions. So my childhood in some ways was an effort to always prove people wrong, that I could do things, that I was as capable as my brothers, that I was as tough as my brothers, and that being a girl didn't in any way mean that I was not able to do things. So I guess in a way that, you know, sometimes when you grow up in a big family, you have a role and you also try to overcome your role. And I would say that I've always tried to overcome my role by trying to be something else or something more. I think women's problem in the contemporary world is difficult to categorize because in places like India or Iran or Saudi Arabia, the problems are really more acute and difficult than, say, women like me in this context. As long as we live in a society that privileges one group over another, men over women or white people over non-white people, people of color, you are essentially building in a system of injustice and inequality and exploitation. Women still have so much that they have to contend with in terms of oppression or inequalities, even in a society like the US. And if you compare it to a place like Iran, of course, it's even more dramatic, that women's professional opportunities are limited, women's mobility is limited, women's ability to speak out and critique patriarchal society is limited, often at the cost sometimes of being jailed or, you know, censured or tortured or even killed. Women should make demands. They should make demands on their husbands and their sons and on their politicians, but they should also continually push to be visible in every professional walk of life. And while I don't care much for Hillary Clinton, I'm going to be honest with you, I think it's really important that there's a female candidate for president. It doesn't mean I have to vote for her. It doesn't mean people should vote for her simply because she's a woman. But the fact that there are women female candidates in political office is very important. My problem sometimes is that they act too much like men. The other day I said to a guy that I know, a friend, I said, you know, you have a very strong feminine quality. And he was embarrassed and like, what are you talking about? And I said, you know, we have to step outside the idea that feminine and masculine are about gender, but about feeling and perception. My son's a painter. I want to help him cultivate that because for me, it's about stretching his perceptions as an artist. So all these paintings that he's doing, you know, this is his work. I'm so excited by the idea that he's using this sense of color and perception to make beauty and that he feels comfortable with that. As comfortable as some of his peers are doing sports. My son doesn't do sports. Is he gay? No, of course not. But I think we have kind of confined the roles of masculine and feminine to certain activities so that people are nervous. Women do have to push for greater education. I think women have to push for, you know, demanding, for example, that reproductive rights are human rights, or women's rights are human rights, that they're not just women's rights. And I think that's what women in Iran are so sophisticated and smart about doing. And it has come at a great cost to them. But I think that they have seen some impact about their struggle and their movement, partly because they recognize this is bad for everybody. This isn't, allowing men to be anything other than what they've always been. You know, people in power, people of privilege. It's ironic that in a place like Iran, most of the kind of the dominant field of poetry and artistry has been men. And when women come up and do it, they're doing just as wonderful things. We have to celebrate that idea that you can transcend your perceptions of yourself based on gender, based on class, based on race, whatever. It's probably easier in a place like the United States to do that than a place like Iran. But I feel that sometimes we think of women's problem or women's perceived problems in the world too much as about women and not about the whole society, and the ways that men are diminished by being in an oppressive situation.